Hi, this is Deb Wenger. Today we're going to be talking about media ethics, and this lecture is based in part on Chapter 14 in our textbook. But I will tell you that most of the questions related to media ethics are going to come from the lecture. I'll highlight a few things from the text that I want you to take away, but the bulk of the questions are really going to focus on what we discuss in this chapter today. So within the text, the author makes a distinction between morals and ethics, and I think that that is an important topic to consider. So morals are an individual's code of behavior based on religious or philosophical principles. Often your morals are determined by the way you're raised, by your family. So morals define what's right and wrong for you in ways that may or may not be rational. On the other hand, ethics is decidedly rational, and it's a way of determining what's good for an individual or for society as a whole. So when there are competing moral principles, ethics is a way of determining how to act when there's not a clear right or wrong answer. And oftentimes media organizations find themselves in this particular space. So obviously there are strong moral stances related to abortion. So when a news organization is trying to decide how best to present a story related to that topic, they need to understand that there are competing moral principles, and they use ethical decision making to come up with the best possible way to address that topic in as ethical a manner as possible. So one of the philosophers, the ethicists that your textbook talks about is Aristotle. And Aristotle, for those of you who have taken classes where this might have been a topic, you'll realize that this is a very simplistic way of describing the golden mean. But the idea is that you can find moral virtue in that middle space between two extremes. The problem is someone like media ethicist David Martinson says that journalists sometimes take an overly simplistic view of this and assume that essentially compromise between the extremes is the best place to be versus finding the truth of the matter. So a good way to explain this, I think, is to say if you take a look at something like global warming. So a vast majority of scientists in the world believe that global warming is a real concern for the environment. There are some, a much smaller number, who believe that global warming is not caused by carbon emissions and other things that man is doing to the environment, that it's just part of a natural cycle of things. And so it may be that journalists, by always including both points of view, may actually be making the truth about global warming more murky. So sometimes by making sure that you offer extremes on both sides of an issue, you may leave people with a sense that the issue is not decided, that there isn't a clear answer, when in fact there may be. Now, I'm not saying that there is on global warming. I'm just saying that that is an argument that some people make about why trying to find that compromise between two extremes may not always lead to the best information. And so journalists have to be aware of that. So a big question for journalists today is whether or not ethics are evolving. And I would say for any kind of communicator, this is a question because of the rapid technological changes taking place in the area of communications. So if you look at journalism ethics in particular, the definition that Wikipedia shares with the world is that journalism ethics and standards comprise principles of ethics and good practice as applicable to the specific challenges faced by professional journalists. So what I key in on here is the words good practice. So because the practice of journalism is changing, I do think some of our responses to ethical issues have to change along with that. So the Society of Professional Journalists is the largest and oldest professional organization of journalists in the U.S. and potentially in the world. And when they talk about ethical decision making, two key points always come up. One is that journalists, to make an ethical decision, have to be asking the right questions. So before you make a decision, you need to be thinking about all the people who might be affected by the decision that you're about to make, and be thinking about what you need to know to make the best decision possible. And you do all this in trying to come up with a defensible answer. So one of the things about journalists is that we're beholden to our public. And when we're making an ethical decision, going through a process of asking these questions will help us be able to defend to the public why we decided to do what we did. I would say this is a good process for anybody involved in any kind of ethical decision, but certainly any kind of PR, advertising, journalism decision, this is a good process. So SPJ has a code of ethics, and the number one principle is to seek truth and report it. So the idea is the truth is paramount, and that when we are operating as journalists, we always work in aid of the truth. Sometimes that's more challenging than you may think. Often information is only as good as the source that we get it from, and sometimes sources aren't telling us the truth, or they're giving us only part of the story. So we can only do the best job possible when we're trying to report truthfully. The second one is to minimize harm. So this is again where we think about all the people affected by our stories. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but the idea that there are stakeholders, there are people beyond the journalists, including the public, including the players within the story, including the people who own the news organization. There are many, many stakeholders involved in ethical decisions. Act independently. So this is the idea that journalists should not be beholden to advertisers, should not be influenced by the organizations that we as individual journalists might belong to. So if I'm a member of the NRA, it's probably not a good idea for me to do stories about gun control, because I obviously have a point of view on that topic. And then finally, be accountable. So this is this idea that, we don't just report stories and then refuse to justify our actions when they're called into question, that we're accountable to the audience, to the people that we serve. So your textbook talks about images of September 11th that raised ethical considerations. So AP photographer Richard Drew had the famous falling man photo. So the photo showing a man jumping from the World Trade Center on 9/11, or perhaps falling, but a lot of people believe people were probably jumping. And the questions that surrounded the decision to take the photo and to publish the photo. So why would somebody potentially use a picture like that? Well, looking at the code of ethics, number one, seek truth and report it. And Drew himself says that he was documenting history, and the horror of that day was definitely brought home. The truth of that day was reported with that image. So in terms of the journalistic purpose of showing this picture, publishing this picture, was to tell the truth, to seek the truth and report it. Now, the thing about the SPJ Code of Ethics is one element of the code is not necessarily more important than another. So in addition to seeking truth and reporting it, you also have to think about minimizing harm. So consider the stakeholders, the family of people who were trapped in that building on that day, the news organization that was publishing, the public that was consuming this content. So you have to ask yourself, Well, are there things we can do to minimize the potential harm, the distress that the family will feel, the sense of being disturbed that the audience will feel, but at the same time serve the principle of seeking truth and reporting it that the news organization wants to do? So to minimize harm, some news outlets in this situation added a warning, such as a television program. You might have heard this when you've been watching a newscast. They'll say something like, "We want to warn you some of the images in this next story may be disturbing to some." Or putting the photo on the inside pages of the newspaper and warning people in a story on the front page about potentially graphic material later in the paper. Or putting it behind a click on a website so that you know that you are clicking to another page and that on that page may be some potentially disturbing content. So all of these were strategies to try to minimize harm to people who might be upset by these photos. So truthfulness, as we said, is one of the primary elements of the code of ethics. Sometimes, shockingly to a lot of journalists, there's deliberate deception among journalists. Stephen Glass, your textbook talks about, who essentially fabricated dozens of stories. And the only reason that appears that he did this is because he wanted to further his career. So truthfulness didn't matter. He was clearly operating in an unethical way. Lying about who you are or what you did has been in the news quite recently, with the NBC nightly news anchor Brian Williams being called out, forced to leave his job as a news anchor, at least temporarily, because some of what he said he did while he was covering some news stories turns out to be a bit of an exaggeration, or perhaps a huge exaggeration. And then finally, there is a question that is raised on occasion about whether deception by reporters is ever okay. If you go undercover and expose human trafficking, so young girls being essentially captured, kidnapped, and then turned into prostitutes, if you're saving their lives, if you're putting an end to this one human trafficking pipeline, then that may be a story where, if there's no other way to get the information, where deception might be considered ethical. But again, this is very dangerous territory and should never be entered into lightly. So with new media, do we have a need for some new views of media ethics? That's a big question. Everything from our ability to capture information with mobile phones means that invasion of privacy is easier. Apps that essentially take photographs and then allow you to adjust how that photo actually appears, raises questions of, is that truth? Social media, lots of questions related to social media. Legal questions, such as we discussed in the chapter on media law, but also ethical questions. Should we use a social media post in our news stories without getting permission from the person who posted the information? Even if it's legal, is it ethical? And then the idea of aggregation, the idea of, even if it's legal to take information that one person posts and then, you use fair use rules to repost it and create something new, is it ethical to do that without giving them credit? So we are asking ourselves, do the old rules apply? So let's take a case of Twitter. This was back when the Occupy Wall Street protests were going on. NBC in New York, the NBC local station, put out a tweet that said their chopper had just been told by the NYPD that they were needing to move because the NYPD was closing airspace over the protests. So you'll note that tweet went out at about 4:11 p.m. little bit later, about 27 minutes later, the NYPD tweets that they have no authority to close airspace. They have not done that, and they will never do so. So essentially saying, hey guys, you're wrong. Interestingly, a researcher took this as a case study and found that the misinformation, so the incorrect information, was being tweeted at a little after 7 p.m. that evening about 200 times a minute. So this piece of information essentially went viral. The correction peaked at about 100 times per minute. Issue here is that the wrong information spread much more rapidly and was much more widespread than the correct information. So that caused some people to ask, is there a need for a correct function, just like we have the reply and the retweet functions on Twitter? Do we need a correct function that would automatically send a correction to everyone who had retweeted something that contained an error? Now, on the face of it, you might think, well, that makes a lot of sense. I think we should give it a try. But to make a good decision on whether or not there's a need to do this, if this is the ethically correct thing to do, you want to consider all the arguments. So as this discussion was playing out among journalists and other interested parties, some arguments against creating a correction tool came out. So it was the idea that real-time news like Twitter puts unique demands on consumers of news, and that the users of Twitter and other social media need to understand that this is news as it happens. And because it's more open and participatory, more people are involved in it, that's going to lead to errors. And that ultimately the best practice would be that everybody who's participating needs to be equally dedicated to verifying and evaluating information. So if you tweet something or retweet something and you find out it's wrong, it should be just as much your responsibility to make that correction as it should be for the person who originally posted the inaccurate content. So ultimately, Twitter decided, at least for now, not to do this based on kind of trying to understand what the general feeling and what the arguments were on both sides of the equation. So that's how you can arrive, I think, often at the best decision is by incorporating as many different points of view as possible. So there's a guy by the name of Stephen Ward, another media ethicist, and he has some thoughts about what the future media ethics and the ethical codes should focus on. One of the things that he talks about is as the way that journalism is funded changes, so nonprofit journalism is getting more common. There are advocacy types of journalism that are produced, investigative centers that might be attached to academic units like a university. So as all of these things change, we probably need to think about how our ethical responses are going to need to change. So let's take a look at this story. The Seattle Times did a really good series of stories on homeless, so what they called invisible families. And just looking at this snapshot of the homepage for the portion of the website where these stories existed, you probably don't see anything that raises any immediate ethical red flags. But if you happen to read the section on about this project, you'll see that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded this series in part. Relatively small grant, $15,000, but it was important, the Seattle Times thought, for this to be disclosed. So ultimately, this whole idea of conflicts of interest is something your textbook talks about, and something that is very important and probably one of the biggest issues facing journalists today. So if you're watching Fox News, let's say, and they report on something in the Wall Street Journal, you will often hear them say, according to the Wall Street Journal, an organization owned by News Corp, our own parent company. So they want to make sure that it's clear to you that they're reporting on something that you might perceive there would be a potential conflict of interest. So the idea that the more that we share about the reporting that we're doing and our any kind of relationships or ties we have to any of the sources or principles involved in that story, the more ethical the behavior is. News organizations and professional sports team. Your text talks about the Chicago Cubs, owned in part by the Tribune Company. And did that ownership influence the way that they covered the team? So this idea of transparency is clear. Make sure, or is key, make it clear to your audience any relationships you have with anyone involved in the story. And what you'll find is that oftentimes news organizations will get called out when they don't do this kind of transparent reporting on the front end and somebody finds out. Even if really nothing that they did was unethical, there's going to be the perception that they were unethical because they didn't disclose the relationship. So for example, when I have students in my news reporting classes and they want to report on something that they're involved in, I have a student reporting on Young Life, and he's a member of Young Life. I tell him, you need to make sure at the end of the story that you disclose to your audience that you are a member of this organization, because your reporting could be influenced by your membership in the organization. All right, digital photo editing. Your textbook talks about this as a major area of ethical concern. So questions arise when it comes to photo manipulation, the things that you can do in Photoshop, for example. How much editing is too much? So can we make a photo a little bit lighter or darker and still not be crossing any ethical lines, for example? Should we disclose to viewers? So this idea of transparency again. Should we disclose to people what we've done to a photo if it's been altered in any way? And if we intentionally make a change in the photo, how is that going to change the viewer's response? So I think your text talks about a photo, essentially digitally they removed a body part from the photo because it was the aftermath of a train crash, and that might be just too disturbing. When you are making a change that's going to change the viewer's response, you need to ask yourself about whether or not what you're doing is actually ethical. The most important thing is to never deceive. So if what you're doing to the photo might deceive someone into thinking the situation is different than it actually was, then it's probably unethical. And Time magazine put an Instagram photo on its cover, and many photojournalists expressed the view that this is unethical because filters were being used. This does not show an accurate depiction of what the storm actually looked like. I think this was Hurricane Sandy that we're talking about here. And as such, that it became deceptive to the audience. On the other hand, other photojournalists would say, that's crazy. This, no one's being deceived here. It was a powerful storm. It caused a lot of damage. All we're doing is using a new tool that helps make a powerful statement about the impact of this storm. So again, bringing in more points of view, trying to figure out how to make the best decision possible, and then being able to defend that decision is the goal of most of what we're talking about here when it comes to ethical decision making. Now, for advertisers, there's certainly a belief that truth in advertising is both an ethical and a legal responsibility. It is very important for advertising claims to be true. I show the Skechers picture here because I think this is a good example of what I'm talking about. So although the Federal Trade Commission takes claims about drugs and food, health issues very seriously, ultimately advertisers get away with claiming to be the best or the most effective, and little to nothing happens to them. Now with Skechers, you may or may not remember, Skechers actually claimed health benefits for its shoes, and it turns out that those just weren't true. The Federal Trade Commission did fine the company about $40 million, which sounds like a lot of money until you realize that they made many, many times that with the sale of the shoe. So ultimately, how effective, how much impact does the FTC's fines have? There's debate about that issue. So truth in advertising, important, but it's safe to say that many advertisers get away with blurring the lines between truth and lies with regularity. So PR also has an ethical dimension to it. The Public Relations Society of America has a statement of professional values. You'll notice there's some similarities with the Code of Ethics for the Society of Professional Journalists. So PRSA says that the essential goal is to serve the public interest, even above the interests of clients. Accuracy and truth are paramount. We talked about this in the Public Relations chapter, that good PR is always founded in truthful information. And the idea that dealing fairly with everyone involved, dealing fairly with, I think you could use the word stakeholders, is a very important element of what makes PR ethical. So there are certainly PR examples where questionable ethics are involved. There's a company called Great Lakes Loans that was bashed in the media for its campaign, in which it was sort of linking the idea that if you were participating in the social media accounts of Great Lakes, that you were going to be much less likely to end up defaulting on your loan, somehow hinting that people who liked the Facebook page or followed Great Lakes on Twitter would be able to successfully pay back their loans versus people that were disconnected would end up defaulting on their loans. So this was criticized as being unethical, an unethical way of pushing students who had taken out loans from this company, of forcing them, making them feel like they were obligated to participate in social media. So that was considered an unethical PR practice. So ultimately, any kind of ethical decision making related to communications can fall back on these two key points. One is to make sure you're asking the right questions. So are you asking yourself whether or not it's actually fair to make people feel like they might default on their loans if they don't like your Facebook page? Is it right to tell people that a shoe is going to help them have better looking legs when that's not necessarily true? Is it right to share somebody's Facebook photo if in fact you don't have permission from the person to use it, even if it's legal for you to use it? So asking those questions, asking who's going to be harmed by this. Am I telling the audience everything they need to know about my personal involvement with the story? And then to be able to include enough different points of view in my decision so that I can defend that to my public to whom I'm accountable. So be sure to do your Blackboard quiz for the week, and you just have a little bit of time left to tweet using the hashtag UMJOUR101. And don't forget about the discussion question posted on Blackboard for this week as well.